Hello, and welcome to episode number 146 of A Mic on the Podium, with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a British conductor who studied with Norman Del Mar at the Royal College of Music, and then went on to become the head of conducting at the Royal College of Music for 14 years. He then left and concentrated on his own career, and since 2014 he has been the principal conductor and artistic director of the Goiás Philharmonic Orchestra in Brazil. It's a great pleasure to welcome Neil Thomson. Neil, I think we've just worked out it was 11 years ago we had a splendid lunch in Paris with somebody who's inextricably linked to this podcast because his music appears at certain points, a mutual friend, Ben Dawson. So that was the last time we met, and I remember it being a wonderful time. How the devil are you?
I'm fine. A lot has changed since then. I mean, I lived in Paris for 14 years, but since the last 7 years, I've lived in Brazil. So a big life change. So.
Well, as you warned me earlier, we may hear some claps of thunder because you told me there's a thunderstorm on its way. But let's leave Brazil and go back via Paris and London and find out how music first came into your life, where it started, whether you come from a musical family or whether, like me, it just appeared out of the blue. How did music first come into your world?
There was always music in our house. My dad was a policeman. My mum worked as a secretary in a law firm. And I didn't know any classical music. The only music we had in the house was Frank Sinatra, shows. I mean, John Wilson always laughs. I always said probably the first music I heard was Paint Your Wagon, the old, which is actually the Andre Previn film version of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I knew South Pacific, Oklahoma, a couple of Frank Sinatra LPs. So music was always in our home, but I was not exposed to classical music. That came at school. I was very lucky. I went to a school in Dulwich, which had a very, very good music department. And my best friend played the violin, and I thought it looked rather interesting, and I got it into my head, and I pestered my mother to have violin lessons. And the guy teaching violin didn't have any vacancies, and she tried for a year, and eventually I think the director of music just felt sorry for her and said, okay, we'll find a space for your son. So that was when I was 7.
So I was 9, but so the violin was the first thing. I mean, I do ask this a question occasionally of other string players. Did you ever go on to the piano? Because I tried and was useless at it, but was it something you were encouraged to take up?
I was encouraged to take up, and of course, in those days, if you wanted to study conducting, it was almost de rigueur that you had to do it. And I remember it was talking with Michael Goff-Matthews, who was the director of the RCO when I was a student, because he was on the audition panel to study with Norman. And it was clear that I was a very weak pianist. I had to try and sight read something. And he said, I think as musicians, we spend so much time worrying about the things we can't do. And we should concentrate on the things we can do. So at that moment, I forgot about the piano. I was never going to be a pianist. It's a waste of time. I could use my time better doing other things,
But before you studied with Norman Del Mar, which we'll come to soon, you did 3 years at the Royal Academy studying violin and viola, I read. Always a handy thing because the world has always needed viola players.
No, but it was the best thing I ever did. I mean, I studied when I was at school. I studied violin with Ralph Holmes. He was a lovely, lovely man and a great musician. And he died very young. He died the summer I was supposed to start at the academy. So I studied violin with a very nice lady called Winifred Roberts. She'd known Vaughan Williams very well, she knew she played the Britten Violin Concerto for Britain. But at the end of my first year exam, I mean, I'm big, I'm tall, and the violin, now I see it looked like a toy on me. And I think it was Clarence Myerscough was on the panel, and he said, that boy should be playing the viola. He's not a violin player. I don't know. Attention problems. It just didn't work. And so I changed to the viola and I studied with Ian Jewell from the Gabrielli Quartet, who, if I ever learned anything about how to get a sound out of an orchestra, a string sound, I learned from Ian. Because, a viola doesn't play itself. You've got to make it work. Yes. We've got nothing acoustic in our favor. So I think switching to the viola for me, musically and from a conducting point of view, things that would be useful for me was the best thing I ever did. And also unless you're playing the Adagio from Mahler 10 or Shostakovich 5, you have a little bit more, bandwidth when you're playing an orchestra to listen around. You're not so busy trying to play the first violin out of Don Juan. so I found it very useful being in the middle of the orchestra. So
Well,
that was a big moment for me.
That was going to be my point also. I mean, unless you do some, I suppose you could call it the German seating or the Berlin Phil seating, where the violas are on the outside on the right. You, the violas, and us, and I talk about us as in the second violins, as in my job which I had for 22 years. We're right in the middle, and so the wind sound goes over the top of us, the brass sound goes over the top of us. We can hear the bass to our left, and we can hear the first violins to our right, and we get a front-on view of the conductor. If you're as into conducting as we are or were, it's almost the perfect place. Talking of conducting, we've leapt on a little bit. But when did you, to use Håkan Hardenberger's phrase, take your first draft of stick poison or contract stickitis, as Pete Hill would say, my dear friend?
It's something that I kind of always wanted to do. I think from about the age of 11, I knew that I wanted to be a conductor. And I put together a little string group when I was about 13, and we did the first movement of Eine kleine Nachtmusik. I've still got my score, actually, that were all sort of nice, were marked up with rehearsal points, things I was going to say. Then when I was 14, I decided to put on a concert in a local church, and I used local amateurs. I think I got a pro, and I paid them, I think it was like £20 or something, which, 1980, whatever it was, 1983 was okay. And I did a concert, Grieg, Holberg Suite, Mozart 41, and Gluck Overture to Orfeo. And of course, I literally didn't have a clue. I was only used to conducting along to LPs. And I remember the last movement of the Jupiter just got faster and faster and faster and faster. I didn't have any way to control it. And I walked off stage and I said to Mother, I never want to conduct again. I'm never going to do this again. But, I kept going. I got involved a lot in amateur orchestras, putting on concerts myself. And then I had my own amateur orchestra when I think my first year at the Academy, when I was 18. The Hayes Symphony Orchestra in West Wickham in Kent. But these, very well, so these are invaluable when you're starting out, because you learn how to rehearse, you learn how to fix things.
Yeah.
And for me, that experience of working with amateur orchestras and later with youth orchestras was the best school you can have.
Absolutely, I completely
in terms of learning the nuts and bolts of what it means to be a conductor.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, I now, out of loyalty to my dear CBSO, I rehearse the CBSO Youth Orchestra and take one of those courses a year. And there are two amateur orchestras I conduct on a regular basis because, again, out of blind loyalty, I've been with one of them since 2002, and the other one's just the best amateur orchestra I've ever heard. But as you say, to learn those abilities of how to fix things, what to fix, more's the point, because you can't fix everything with an amateur orchestra. What to fix to make it suddenly become a viable proposition as a concert.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
where to throw the blanket of discretion in other places where you just know it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah, you learn a lot of tricks that way. That's for sure. How to make something sound better with what you've got.
Exactly.
I think that's no.
I'm assuming, therefore, that the Royal College or somewhere of similar ilk was always on the horizon beyond the Royal Academy. So did you go into it knowing that maybe being a professional viola player or violinist was not on your radar, and it was all about getting through that and going on and doing a postgrad as a conductor?
It was. I was a nightmare as a student because I never practiced. But I was just there. I was doing more conducting than I was viola playing, but I loved playing in the orchestras at the Academy, and I was there really at a golden age. I remember my first rehearsal with the Academy Symphony Orchestra was with Antal Dorati, doing Mozart 39 and the Emperor Valse, and then we did Brahms 2 with him. Rattle came in when he wanted to try out things that he was doing, probably with CBSO, like a Brahms 1, Enigma Variation, Beethoven 9. We had a lot of Marvis Schulte came in to do a repertoire session, and I was there in the golden era of Maurice Hanford.
Ah, yes.
Who is a divisive figure, and I actually made a sort of a tribute post to him on Facebook, and I got a lot of I wouldn't say abuse, but a lot of comments from players who absolutely hated his guts. And I know he was divisive, but my God, he was good. If I learned from anyone how good a student orchestra could be and should be, I learned it from Morris, and that really set me in good stead for when I started working at the college. Yeah. You know, he was like, you're in the profession now. I remember I played in his last concert. Yet again, he was probably 58, 59, but he was an absolute chain smoker. I mean, yeah. And he cancelled all his professional work to do one last concert with the Academy Symphony Orchestra, and he chose Vaughan Williams 2, which was the first piece that he played with Barbarolli as first horn. And there's a beautiful old recording from the 50s with Morris. I think he was called The Whispering Horn because he had a magical piano. And if you ever get a chance to listen to that slow movement, it's so beautiful. And for us, it was a very emotional experience because, you know, when he gave the last downbeat, there was a sort of terrible resignation on his face. And then we all filed off backstage, and he was sitting at the top of the steps of the old Duke's Hall with a fag and a glass of whiskey. And we all basically just shook his hand and said goodbye. And he died 6 days later.
Wow.
That was impactful. Yeah. And I remember, you know, when we came back in the new year, we had some very well-known guest conductors coming in, and we were like a sort of, you know, a bunch of old pros saying, Morris would never let this through. Morris would never let this. It's not together. It's not good enough, you know. So he was an important influence, not in my way of being as a person, but in what you can expect from people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a marvelous phrases. He would just sort of point out someone and say, "You'll starve. You'll starve." You play that because he knew how hard the freelance scene was. Yeah. I remember once we were supposed to do Fledermaus Overture and Brahms 3 in a repertoire session, and we only did Fledermaus. And he did it over and over again with different rubato. He said, because you're going to go to the London Concert Orchestra in the days, you know, the good old Raymond Gabay days, and maybe the conductor's going to top and tail it, and you just have to know all the possible rubato. So that was real training. You know, he was thinking of us. Yeah. There was an oboe player, but he stopped him. He said, "Tell me, old chap," he said, "do you have a hobby?" And the guy was a little bit sort of flummoxed. And he said, "Well, I like, stamp collecting." He said, "No, something you can earn a living at." I mean, it would be absolute no today.
Well, but I mean, as you know,
it was a good training.
Yeah, as you know from my day, he conducted the CBSO an awful lot. In those days there would have been Victor Hockhauser dates. You know, we're talking in the 60s and 70s. And the stories are legendary about. I met 2 or 3 players, one in particular who lives just around the corner. He said his first day's work was Morris conducting, and he started Don Juan, did a couple of corners in the middle, and then you know did the end, and he did pretty much the same with all of the movements of Chike 5, whatever it was in the concert. And he said, "See you later." And my friend sat there and said, "What? Is that it?" And that, you know, he knew the band knew it, and he knew he would conduct it brilliantly and get them through it. As you said, the phrase "you'll starve," everybody knew about that. But yeah,
the other one was release the tide note. That was
release the
tide note.
Yeah.
But that stayed with me now. You know, and the number of times I say it to my orchestra here. You know, release the tide note.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, well, it's a name who's never cropped up in all of the episodes I've done, but a real seminal. There's a whole generation of people who were trained by him, were conducted by him in the profession, and as you said, incredibly talented. The amount of people who said he was just incredibly clear. You just knew exactly what he wanted. Hence the fact that no need to rehearse. But yeah, I'm assuming if you were a student under him and you got the wrong side of him, he was somebody you weren't sending a Christmas card to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But you know, when he died, we did a memorial concert, and it was Simon Rattle who came to conduct it. So Simon was someone who really thought highly of. He described him as, I think there's a lovely phrase, a benign despot, because that's in a way that's what he was. So.
Well, let's change characters, and you do a postgrad, and you go to Royal College of Music and study under another name that has come up a lot on this podcast, Norman Del Mar. How long were you there? Was that a 2-year postgrad? And what do you remember of those times with Norman?
Well, he changed my way of thinking about conducting, because like most conductors, I come through the Canford school, and just go off piste for a moment. I mean, George Hurst was another divisive figure. Great musician, great conductor, but very much a sort of one size fits all school. You had to do this. And I went to Norman, and he would say, "Oh, it's so boring. It all looks the same. All looks the same." And I learned from Norman, you can say sort of the grammar of conducting, the vocabulary of conducting, of how you can vary sounds and characters. And of course, all the things about his scholarly knowledge of scores for misprints. He was always slightly disappointed when people focused on that, because he wanted people to think of him as a conductor, not a musicologist. But of course, that was. I mean, there was virtually no piece he didn't know. He was slightly miffed one day when I asked him about Kurt Weill's Second Symphony, because he didn't know it, and he didn't like not to know a piece. I mean, he could tell you about misprints in Lennox Berkeley 3, but he didn't know Kurt Weill 2, so that was a minor triumph. But he was, I adored Norman. I mean, there's not a day that I don't think of him. There's not a lesson that I teach that I don't say, "Oh yeah, Norman said." So he was a huge influence on me, and helped to get me a little bit outside that Canford box, which also, I mean, Canford gave me my basic technique. I mean, that was certainly something. And George's way of looking at an orchestra, how to balance an orchestra, how to understand the internal dynamic of a Brahms symphony or a Beethoven symphony, when to take time, when to push. These sort of things were invaluable musically for me. But Norman was much more liberating in that respect. I found him a fascinating man, really a fascinating man. Another person, a bit like Morris, often people would say he could be his own worst enemy, that probably didn't always do his career justice. But it was lovely to see him towards the end, shortly before he died, how he was sort of welcomed back into the profession. And I remember going, to RPO rehearsals, and everyone said, "Oh, it's a great pleasure to see Norman," everyone tapping their stands. It was really nice that towards the end of his life, he got, I think, the recognition that he deserved.
And I'm assuming it would have been towards the end of that. You ended up going to Tanglewood. And so, already you've mentioned two very, very seminal teachers in George Hurst and Norman Delmar, but then there are four names listed that were teaching when you went to Tanglewood. Gustav Meyer, another huge name. I've got his book behind me on the bookshelf. Kurt Sanderling Sejiazawa, God rest his soul, recently died. And of course, the great Leonard Bernstein, who was nearing the end of his life in 1989.
Yeah, it was his penultimate Tanglewood.
Yeah.
Ozawa, because, with what happened recently, I sort of set me thinking. And I remember there are possibly two conductors who completely changed my view of conducting, my life. One was Ozawa. And I remember standing behind the percussion when he was conducting the student orchestra, Daphnis Second Suite, with my mouth open. I'd never seen conducting so refined, that the hands had such color and atmosphere, but precision and character.
Yeah.
It was breathtaking, and the control of these long lines and the way he molded the sound. And the other one was Kleiber. It was on the days when the BBC used to show full operas. It was a Fledermaus from Bavarian State Opera. I think in 1989. It was the same year I went to Tanglewood. It was things I've never thought that someone could phrase the way Kleiber did. I mean, that was the thing I think that one learns most from him. I think very often our younger colleagues, and I spent a lot of time trying to knock it out of students. They think that the gesture is everything, rather than the what's behind it. And I tell them, I listen to his recordings, don't just watch his videos.
Absolutely. I did a thing on Patreon where it was much near the end of his life, where he does a Brahms 4 in the Hercules Saal in Munich. And somebody asked me to try to explain what he was doing when he was during the Brahms. And as I said, I didn't talk about the gestures. I talked very much about the reason for it and you showing the phrasing. I pointed out in the second movement of Brahms 4 in that performance, I think he beat a visible 6 twice. The rest of it was all about the shape and the phrasing, because he doesn't need to beat in 6. The orchestra knows it where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was all about the shaping and the phrasing and the independence of his arms and the beauty of it to show what he wanted. I mean, when you look back on those four names and them being on the teaching faculty, Was it, other than watching Ozawa, which must have been absolutely amazing, was there anything that you take from those days that you could add to George Hurst and to Norman Del Mar and think, that's another, arrow in my quiver or another tool in my toolkit?
I think I've learned these things from Ozawa,
Mm.
just how much you could show. And from Bernstein, I learned that you have to somehow embody the music when you're conducting.
Yeah.
His thing was, I can't read you. I can't read you. The biggest compliment he said is, I can read you.
Yeah.
And I remember I did the second movement of the Hafner Symphony with him, and it started, and I was nervous, and eventually said, I can't read you. Now I read you. And that was, for me, that was the big moment. Okay, yeah. I was transmitting something, And Bernstein had a wonderful technique, completely. I mean, he studied with Fritz Reiner, so he knew how to do things, but he was the person, like Simon Rattle, had a way of just transmitting musical ideas.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I learned. From Gustav Meyer, I learned a sort of a great discipline. I always found with Gustav Meyer, this is probably heretical, that he hadn't done enough real professional conducting. Sometimes he would tie you up in knots over slightly abstract things. That it was someone who had a lot of time to sit and think about things.
Yeah.
And I'm not actually be busy doing them. Mm. So that was my feeling. I have to say, I find his book almost unreadable. That may also be heretical. I mean, there are a couple of chapters I like, the zigzag, which he learned from Eleazar de Carvalho, great Brazilian maestro here. Yeah. But I find most of the book a little bit unreadable. So,
yeah, the word ictus appears on about 5 times a page, and
all this, and all this thing of sort of, this semi-quaver is like 48.75 to the crotchet. I mean, to me that doesn't mean anything.
No,
but I'm a viola player at the end of the day, so I'm not very, I'm a doer, not a thing.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is that, and I was going to say it anyway, is that by this point, you've had so much technique thrown at you, probably, I'm assuming, by George and Norman, and obviously by Meyer. But actually, in the end, what needs to happen is when you go out and guest conduct and start the fledgling career, your first footsteps into the real world, people want to read you, and they want to read, even if they just, a lovely player in the BBC Symphony Orchestra said, we like you because you look like you're enjoying yourself so much. So if you're enjoying it, well, then we will as well, and to be read by players, and they don't care whether your ictus is perfect or whether you're beating a beautiful 6 in a bar, or they literally just want you want you to feel empowered and help them play better. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So after Tanglewood, Neil, what then? Where do we, when we come back home, what then?
Well, my plan was, I got a scholarship, British Council scholarship, to go and study with Musin in what was then still, I think, Leningrad. Yeah, I think it was 1989. And then there was one of those sort of periodic diplomatic spats in which the Russians kicked out a lot of British spies and we kicked out a lot of Russians.
A lot back,
and with it went cultural things. Yeah. So, in fact, one of the men, he worked for TASS, the Soviet old news agency. He'd helped me with my visa application. He was one of the people that got kicked out. He turned out he was a KGB spy.
Right.
So anyway, that went out the window. Then Norman recommended me for an assistant's job in the orchestra in Porto, which was started up by, and that also fell through. So I was literally left high and dry.
Yeah.
And Edwin Roxburgh, bless his heart, one of the great people at the Royal College as a student and who influenced me. He said, "Well, look, I'll come and be a guest conductor for what was then the 20th Century Ensemble." So I went and did a concert, and it went well. And there was another professor who was, after Norman retired, they had Chris Adey and then John Forster, and then Chris left, and then John was kind of running and he had a lot of health issues. So I started covering for him, and I think must have been in about 1990, 1991. No, 1990. It was after. It was I think it was the January after Tanglewood, and it turned out that I really, really liked teaching. It was something I think, and I'd come back from Tanglewood full of ideas and probably some useful pedagogical tips from people like Gustav Meyer, and so I kind of fell into the job, and then eventually John did less and less. I did more and more. Janet Ritterman came; she appointed me to the job. So I did my career the wrong way around, because normally those jobs are what people retire into. But I started it, and it was great. I was there 14 years, and it was some of the most productive period of my life. I mean, I love teaching. And Janet, basically, she gave me carte blanche to rebuild the orchestras.
Right.
And so I programmed whatever I wanted. No, it was great. It was really great.
And I was going to go to it later, but I'm not. I'm going to stick with it right now, because we can find out how and why you stopped and went out and did things back to front. So I'm going to stick with the Royal College. So if you look at yourself as a teacher, I often use the analogy of there's the Musin, very much about the technique and his circles and his figures of 8, and versus the Hans Sarowski, who apparently barely ever taught technique at all, and it was all about scores. As a teacher, were you somewhere in the middle, or did you lean in one direction more than the other? And what was a typical week like for you in the teaching world, not just conducting the orchestras at the Royal College?
My premise was then, as it is now, is that what I'm teaching you is to express musical ideas. Yes. It's not that the technique and ideas are integrated. So we always start, what is the idea? What is it you're trying to transmit? And I teach that. So it's a mixture of the two. Of course, there are certain basic technical things you can do, but that could be taught very, the technique of conducting can be taught in an hour, and then it's another sort of 50 years of practice, putting it into practice. So it was very much based on expressing ideas. What's the idea? How do we do this? And trying to get, I guess what I learned from Ozawa, the widest range of vocabulary in your technique. Basically, my week was, normally I did a second study class Monday morning, and then I taught my postgrads in the afternoon. Then when I first started, there were weekly rehearsals, and that's something that I managed to shut down. Right. We had, we started doing project-based rehearsals, and so I would be there for 2 weeks or so working with that. So it was every week Monday teaching, and then depending on and I had access to the College Symphony Orchestra as well, which is very useful. When Haydn came in doing Mahler 6 or Shostakovich 8, I could work on that with the postgrads, so they would get a chance to do a movement of this. We would occasionally have repertoire sessions, standalone repertoire sessions. No, but I owe an awful lot to Janet Ritterman. Yeah. I mean, she backed me when a lot of people wouldn't have done, and in fact didn't. So, but she was 100% behind me. So I'm eternally grateful to her for that. Yeah. And it was a sort of, I chat with people like John, and it was a sort of golden age for orchestras at the RCM. It was really, that's what we were known for. So that's a source of great pride for me. And I still bump into people, and they say, "God, I remember you said this in rehearsal." Oh, God, it's like 30 years ago. Yeah. If you play like that, you'll end up. Actually, you need to edit this out. But if you play like that, it's John Mills, leader of the ECO. If you play like that, you'll end up at the back of a ballet orchestra. So you can edit. And he said, I went to see a ballet the other day, and I really understood what you meant.
I might keep that in.
But I mean, it's. No, I mean, this is why, and this is also why you know this as well. When it's lovely, you go and see your old student in orchestra, you turn up on a date, and it's someone you haven't seen for 40 years. Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
So. And isn't it lovely? I mean, I'm seeing it now really on a regular basis, because the CBSO Youth Orchestra is 20 years old this year, and I've been involved since the very beginning, doing the nuts and bolts stuff, and then handing it over to the conductor who does the concert, maybe 2 days out. But I do 5, 6, 7 days of rehearsals before then, so I get to know the orchestra, and I do the hard. I'm the hard, I'm the bad cop, and then the good cop comes in and gets all of the credit. But I'm now seeing these players out in the profession. Virtually every professional orchestra I go to in the UK, there are players there who I've possibly said something to that they've remembered, or I've said something to and they've took umbrage to, whatever else. But then later on realised actually what he said then was correct, and it is really nice. I did a Shostakovich 8 recently in Birmingham with the CBSO, and I think there were 12 people on the platform who were all gone through that system.
That's
all the conservatoire.
This is wonderful.
Yeah,
it's wonderful. I think at the time sometimes we don't realise the influence that we're having because we're so sort of tied up with actually just doing the job and getting things done. But it's clear that when someone remembers something you said 30 years ago, it's I think now I'm slightly more aware as a teacher. You have to be careful what you say because people will remember it.
Yes.
So
I also agree with what you did, because when I first started at the Conservatoire in Birmingham in 1988, we were rehearsing in the Symphony Orchestra every Friday all day, which meant that there was a concert at the end of the term. And if I look back on it, if I'd have been the conductor then, which point of this sort of Loch Ness monster shape of improvement was the orchestra on when we get to the concert? Was it at the top of the loop or the bottom of the loop? Whereas going to a whole solid week of rehearsals is much more like the profession, even though obviously the UK is even shorter than a week. But it a lot more focused in a shorter time period gives an awful lot more feeling of what it's going to be like when you get out there. And everybody can sort of come together around that week. I recently did one in Scotland and in 1 week, and it was great. And the conductors, all the 5 student conductors could be there, and they could watch and take part, and I could give them podium time. And it was a big event rather than me just turning up every Friday, and that doesn't work.
No, and also it's we're supposed to be training them for the profession, and there's a big difference between. I mean, I look at youth orchestras here. They can get to a very good level, but because they've had like a month of rehearsals, and they don't understand why it doesn't translate to getting a job, because here we have a little bit more rehearsal than we have in the UK. We start Monday, concert Thursday, but that's irrespective of the program.
Yeah.
So it's another. You have to get these young people into this vibe because it's going to help them get a job.
Yeah. Before we
survive in a job.
Yeah. Before we go to Brazil, I must ask you how many, because it's a bane of, or no, a point of contention, or a bane of a conducting student / teacher's life, but it's almost necessary. How much time did you spend with 2 pianos? And when you did, how did you sort of encourage the conductors to work and use the 2 piano classes?
I have to say I didn't work with 2 pianos. I found it pretty
good,
useless.
Yeah.
I conduct in silence, and that forces them much more to internal, to really show what they've got inside. You've got to feel something very strongly, and then with a piano, it's even. I used to insist that they had to do this before I let them in front of an orchestra, because an orchestra will carry you. So I needed to know that absolutely what was inside was coming out. Yes. So we would. It was very for the first year. It was very slow work for them. We took. I encouraged them to learn half of the symphony for a lesson, for instance, and we really just took it to bits. Really bar by bar. What's this sound? What's this phrasing? Is this clear? I will the orchestra be able to read you? Then I let them go in the second year. Norman was like this. I remember that's something I learned from him. You would ask him a question. He would say in his sort of wonderful, sort of Woodhouseian way, he's, well, you know my methods, Watson. You know my methods, Watson. And that was it. So, you have to stand on your own 2 feet after a while. 2 pianos was useful when you were doing a piano concerto. It's useful if you're doing Chopin 1 to get around the corners, or sometimes if you're doing like the Rite of Spring. I remember we did a class on that when there was a piano duo who were playing the piece, And the other thing, we had trouble finding pianists who knew how to play for conductors.
Exactly.
And it's eventually you end up following the pianist, because pianists always play directionally, don't they? They don't play like orchestral musicians. This is the thing about Tanglewood. They had 2 Japanese ladies from the Toho school that Ozawa insisted, and they played everything for a full score, and they were like a mirror. It was alarming.
Yeah.
If you slightly change tempo, they changed tempo, because that's all they did. That was their job, to play for the conductor's class in Toho. Wow. But I mean, if you haven't got that, it's not always so useful.
It's a bit like the clips you see of Musin teaching those pianists they had there. They would that was probably their job, and they followed those guys to the. Whereas if you just do it with two pianists, they're not watching you, and it
No,
becomes almost
yeah,
counterproductive because you're following them.
You follow them. That's exactly it. Yeah.
So it sounds like, you enjoyed your time there, 14 years of doing the mental maths. So why stop or why leave? And then eventually, how did we end up as far away from as you can almost get, being in 2014, you become the principal conductor and artistic director of the Goiás Philharmonic Orchestra in Brazil. So how did that journey start to get there?
Well, I think you get to 14 years and there can be a sort of natural fatigue. Yeah. Also, there was a change of director and a slight change of priority given to the orchestras,
right?
Shall we say?
Yeah.
And I decided that it wasn't going to be the same. So a lot of people were saying to me, people like John Wilson said, "Oh, you're crazy. You've got to leave. You've got to go out and be a conductor. This is what you're supposed to be doing."
Yeah.
And I don't know if you felt the same. Moving from being a player, finding the moment is difficult because you think, well, I'm going to wait until I've got enough work.
Yeah,
and it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
I'm
happen.
nodding.
And
it's
so
exactly.
And eventually, I just thought I was getting tired of being there. A lot of changes. I'd moved to Paris by then. I decided. I think that was also part of it. Me saying that I needed a change.
Yeah.
So I could commute back and. I mean, I could get the first Eurostar. I could do a day's teaching, get the last Eurostar back, so I could actually. It's no farther than Manchester by train, and probably with British trains a lot quicker than going to Manchester.
Yeah.
So, and so I just took the plunge. I was living in Paris by then, and I started getting things. John helped me a lot. I mean, got me into the RTE. I started conducting films through him as well. That was a useful thing. Then. After a few years, I was getting more and more, and John's agent, Caroline Oakes, took me on. She said, "Look, we're working a lot for you now." So then I started getting more things. The Brazil connection is funny. I used to teach at a thing called the London Conducting Workshop, and I think it was in 2005 or 2006. There was a Brazilian student there from Goiânia, the city where I live, and he said to me, "Oh, we'll keep in touch. We'll invite you to Brazil." Yeah, sure, great. I didn't hear anything for. I don't know, 6-7 years. And then out of the blue, would you like to come and conduct the orchestra and do a masterclass? And that was, I think, 2012. And I went and did the concert. It was very nice. He said, "Look, next year we're reformulating the orchestra. It's going to be a completely new orchestra. We're doing auditions. It's going to be with a structure. Would you come back and do 2 concerts?" And I came back and did 2 concerts. And the manager of the orchestra, and actually it came from the musicians committee, which I was very happy about. Yes. They said we'd really like Neil to be our chief conductor, and to his credit, the guy who was the conductor agreed. He said to me, actually, the orchestra needs somebody more experienced than me. And how often does that happen? I mean, with conductors, I mean it's so that's really to his credit. So in 2000, it's now my 10th anniversary season. I'm about to start. So that's how I went to Brazil. I started in 2014. I was still living in Paris. Then my life changed. I split up with my ex. I met a Brazilian girl who's now my wife. So in 2017, I decided to move to Brazil.
Yeah,
it's a big life. So it's sort of cycles of 14 years at the Royal College, 14 years in Paris. I'm on my 10th year now, so maybe another 4 years I'll be ready for another change. And it's been great because the orchestra you were building from, not from zero, but you were building from a level that needed a lot of improvement. Yeah. And I had yet again carte blanche. I decided every program, every guest conductor, every soloist within our very sort of limited financial resources. And the orchestra's become a big success story in Brazil. we got we made. I said to my boss, I said the two things we need to do. It's what David Zinman said. He said that if you want to improve an orchestra, you have to do tours and record. Those are the things that will refine the orchestra. So we went to play in Sala San Paolo. This is a big thing for us, and we decided just to make a CD of Brazilian music just to see what it was like. We're very lucky. We've got a guy called Ulrich Schneider, who was Sony's big guy in Europe. He was the engineer on the famous Kleiber Heldenhaven that was never released.
Oh yes,
and he said he spent he said days and days and days in the recording studio with Kleiber. And yes, okay, let's release it. Then a phone call. No, I don't want to release it. He said, but it was fantastic. Yeah. Especially the time when he brought Carlos Kleiber home for dinner, and he called his wife, who's a musician. He said, "Oh yeah, I'm coming. Carlos Kleiber's coming to dinner." She said, "Oh yeah, right." And the doorbell went, and it was Carlos Kleiber. But
oh wow, yeah.
So Uli, he's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. One of the most remarkable musicians. It's not just his ears.
Yeah.
It's how he works with I always say if he became a conductor, the rest of us would be out of a job. I mean, his way of dealing with people, of neutralizing a problem, of getting things sounding good for the disc. Because you know this, very often what we hear is not how it comes across.
No, not at all. No, exactly.
So I mean, and I have a relationship with him now. I trust him 100%. He stopped me from actually making what would have been a really boring recording of a Santoro first movement. Right. He said, "Neil, just come and listen to this." Oh, yeah, it's really boring. So, I mean, I trust him enough not to take anything that he says personally. And he's a 100% artist. Anyway, we made the CD with Uli, and it was just for us to give to the politicians, to give to the audience. And a friend of mine, a Brazilian pianist called Sonia Hubinski, she's a friend of Klaus Heyman and Naxos, and she sent this CD to him. Right. And it turns out that he has a love affair with Brazil. He lived here for a year when he was young, and he loved the disc. He thought the orchestra was terrific. And he said, "Yeah, I'll release it." And this gave the Brazilian Foreign Ministry an idea. Let's make a project to divulgar. No, I'm forgetting words in English now. To promote Brazilian music. And this is what they've done. And it's been one of the biggest success stories. They took 3 orchestras: São Paulo Symphony Orchestra, the Orchestra Philharmónica de Minas Gerais, and us. So we went basically from being an orchestra. Goiás is Goiânia is like the Nashville of Brazil. It's known for Brazilian country and western, Southern Asia. And people, they're a little bit snooty about Goiás in Brazil, the people from São Paulo and from Rio. And so suddenly to have this state recording for Naxos, playing music by Claudio Santoro was a huge thing. I mean, that it changed the perception about music in Goiás. So that was an important thing for me. And the other thing that I think that with the series, the way it's been, to use that horrible word, curated, is to show that there's much more to Brazilian music than just like Gustavo Dudamel's Fiesta disc, which is all party music.
Yeah.
You've got aleatoric music that could be written by Lutosławski. You've got 12-tone abstract expressionist music, as well as the nationalist stuff. But what I've discovered about being here is that Brazil has an astonishing range of classical music, of really, really first-rate composers. So it's, when you go to a country, you have a moral and musical obligation to perform the music of the country. So if you're chief conductor of the Ulaanbaatar Symphony Orchestra, you have to dig out as much Mongolian orchestral music as you can.
Of course.
But for me, it's turned out that it's not just an obligation. It's become a complete labor of love. It's become my sort of mission in life, to get this music played and recorded. And Santoro has written 14 symphonies, and this year we'll close the cycle. So we've recorded 12. We've got 12 in the can. But fantastic music. He's just a little bit like the sort of Brazilian Shostakovich. It has that terseness. Yeah. I mean, there's the 11th symphony. I mean, it's in 17 minutes. He says what it would take a lesser composer to in 60 minutes. It's so compact and so intense and so un-Brazilian of what people think Brazilian music is. I did a gig. We did a gig of it, playing his Concerto Grosso with the ECO last year, And a couple of the players said to me, "Oh, we took this gig on because we thought it would be an evening of samba and bossa nova, and it's sort of horribly difficult atonal music."
Yeah.
So,
Well, Brazilian Shostakovich has piqued my interest, and of course I knew
yeah.
about it because we're friends on Facebook and I've seen releases of them. But I shall go out and seek them down. I mean, seek it out.
Do really, Mike.
Yeah,
and if you ever find a chance to program any of his pieces, we'd be eternally grateful. Because the whole point of this project is to get the music played, not just to record it. We're making editions now of all the scores, so that Brazilian orchestras no longer have an excuse not to play the music. So,
because that's often the problem. I was sent some stuff. I was due to go to Santiago and Chile and conduct, but COVID came. No, there was some civil unrest, and that's why I didn't go. I think they were trying to set the concert hall on fire, so it was a good idea not for me not to go. But the score that was sent to me was almost illegible, a sort of handwritten piece of Chilean music. And that is often the case where, this stuff deserves to be played, but it's never been typeset, or somebody's not just spent the time and the care to get it looking good on a page for people to play it.
Absolutely.
And then it'll fly off the page. If it's readable, then it'll fly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you know very, very well, I mean, as soon as musicians see manuscript, it's a mental block. Everything immediately becomes more difficult than it needs to be. Sometimes even if the manuscript is clear, people just don't like it. Right. Someone said to Michael Tilson Thomas, he said, "Why don't you do, one of the Villa-Lobos symphonies?" He said, "Look, I love Villa-Lobos, but I'm not going to spend 6 months correcting the score." That's correcting the material.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to stay on material because there is an 11th question. It's become an 11th question over the course of the podcast, and it's to do with marking up and learning a score. And you've done everything, as you said, from music live to film to works of Brazilian works that need typesetting and doing, and through to all of the classics and beyond. How do you learn a score? Do you sit there with your inner ear, go through it quickly and then break it down into smaller chunks, or do you go from bar one to the end? And for the geeks amongst us, and I am one of those geeks, are you a red, blue, black man who writes stuff in their scores, or do you keep them as clean as possible? How do you go about it, Neil?
No. Red, blue, and black, absolutely. Yeah. I have these. Oh, you probably have the same. These Karen Dash.
There's one. We're both holding one up on the screen. Yeah.
No, and this was something I learned from Norman. He said that basically you need to mark your score up so that you have all the information that you need at the moment. So I not too little and not too much.
Yeah.
I sometimes see my students and they put things in highlighter and everything. You can't read it.
No.
It's
so that you can look down and quickly see stuff that you need to see. And I'm sure your color system's slightly different from mine. I use blue for all dynamics and articulations. Red is for anything to do with my hands and arms, and black is for all cues and other stuff. But I'm sure whatever you use, you can see straight away.
Exactly. Yeah. But it needs to be clear. I mean, I think that's the thing. When I'm looking at a score, the first thing I do is I go from beginning to end, just looking through it to see the big blocks, and then I go and I put phrase lengths in. For me, marking the phrase periods is very important. It's like cutting up your food before you eat it, and it breaks the piece down into smaller chunks. So once I've done the big sort of the first sort of superficial look through to see the big shapes, then I do a more formal analysis of the shapes, and then I break it down into phrases.
Yeah.
And then I do it. I do the whole score in phrases, and then I go back to the beginning and start marking. So the first thing I will do, the first penciling I will do is the phrases, and then I go through page by page.
Yeah.
Horizontally, vertically.
When you taught, did you encourage marking, or for all of us, all we care about is, do you know the score well enough? For me, I need to mark. You obviously need to mark, but there's, as you can imagine, over 140 episodes, there are some conductors who say there's nothing written in their scores at all. And I know for a fact that Simon Rattle barely writes anything in, because I've seen some of his scores. But whereas others, Ollie Nusson, again, God rest his soul, was a meticulous, very neat, very tidy, but lots of different colours. But when you taught, was it something that you would teach or suggest?
I would suggest. I wouldn't insist on it. Because what you said is absolutely right. Eventually, it matters whether you know the score or not. And if you haven't marked your score up and you're getting horribly lost, well, you don't know it enough, and maybe you can help yourself by. I mean, Leinsdorf was very dismissive. What did he call them? Mental crutches.
Right.
When people would mark like a triangle or a thing. But hey, my score of the Rite of Spring and the Dance like Chorale has it written 3 times. You know. But touch wood, I haven't made a mistake in it yet. So that's so because that's one thing. This thing also about conducting from memory. I once told a student, I said, look, it's fantastic if you're doing a tour of the Rite of Spring and you conduct from memory and you screw up performance number 10. People will remember that more than the other 9 performances where you conducted beautifully. So make sure if you're going to conduct from memory, make sure you've got a good memory. It's important. Because I think musicians then will see it as an act of vanity if you take the score away and you're not so reliable. This is what I loved about Ozawa. Ozawa, he conducted everything without the score, but he always had the score on the stage.
Yeah.
Norman Del Mar said something nice. He said he was doing, I think Brahms' Violin Concerto with David Oistrakh, the Edinburgh Festival in the 60s. And just before they went on stage, Oistrakh said, "You will be using the score, won't you?" And Norman said, "Yes, of course." And Oistrakh said, "No, not for you, of course, but for me."
Yeah.
So you can make soloists nervous, and you make orchestral musicians nervous. I mean, I know that feeling. A guy walks out and there's no score, and everyone's going, "Christ, what's this going to be like?"
Yeah. Oh, I remember that feeling very well. I mean, I often used to say, people say, "Oh, but he's conducting it from memory." I said, "Are you looking in his eyes or her eyes?" There's some searching going on there, and there's an awful lot of circles have appeared at certain moments because I'm not sure they remembered it that as well as they. And I used to call it a parlor trick. You'll think better of me if I do it from memory. Whereas the ones who really knew it from memory, if Zachary did Sibelius from memory, my God, he knew it. Simon used to do an awful lot from memory. The Rite of Spring every time from memory, but he was never going to screw it up. I mean, the man's prodigious memory. You just knew that it was all there. Whereas others, I remember playing for thinking, "Oh my God, you've come out without a score, really?" I watched you rehearse, mate.
Well, it's what Gunther Schuller said. He said, "There's conducting from memory and there's conducting without the score." And I think that there's, and when I was younger, I was probably guilty of that. I think I used to do everything very often the symphony at the college, without the score. And I suddenly realized that I was spending so much time, all I was doing was basically learning a succession of cues. And I thought, actually, I can use my time better really looking at the score and not just spending hours and hours and hours learning cues.
And it's also very much situation based in the fact that I know I can conduct 2 Beethoven symphonies, a Berlioz Overture and a Dvorak Symphony from memory. They're the ones I've done, and they're the ones I'm willing to do until I get to a certain state with other works. Well, I know there are a couple of pieces I'm close to. But for instance, one of those symphonies is the Eroica. I can conduct it from memory, and the last time I did it with a professional orchestra, I did twice, and it was fine, perfect. I know it. The next time I conduct it is with an amateur orchestra in London, who I've been asked to go in and do one concert with, who are the Reform Club Orchestra on Pall Mall. They've got their own orchestra in the Reform Club, and I've been asked to conduct the Eroica Symphony. Do you think I'll be conducting from memory in that concert? No, I won't. Because there may well be somebody there who needs me because they've got completely lost, And I've had that before. I've had timpanists looking at me with those eyes. You've seen those eyes. You think, and I'm looking across thinking, you're lost. You're absolutely lost. And that's when having a score there is a very good idea. Even though I know it from memory and I probably could bring them back in, it's better to have it there in that situation.
Yeah. Because as you said, at the beginning, the most important thing is how it sounds.
Yes.
No one cares about the visual. If I would say, if you really know the score and you think it helps you conduct better, then that's another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But eventually, all of us have to learn how to communicate with a score because you can't memorize everything.
No, you can't.
The bottom line. Because I had a lot of students, because at the beginning they would memorize everything. And they would say, "Oh, yeah, well, I can't conduct this piece because I haven't memorized it." I said, "Well, what are you going to do when you've got to do the Elliott Carter Piano Concerto?" It's...
Yeah, or you accept a jump in with the RPO, which could be a life-changing thing with a piece you think you vaguely know, but you've got 24 hours before the concert. What are you going to do then?
Yeah.
You've got to learn. Got to learn to conduct with a score and without one, and that's exactly what it is. What would you do if an orchestral player spoke to you aggressively, or even tried to take over the rehearsal? How would you react if a soloist had a memory slip and needed your assistance? In recent weeks, I've started a new series on my Patreon page called What Would You Do in This Situation?, where topics like these are discussed using real-life encounters. It started a lot of discussion and is proving hugely popular with my subscribers. Subscribing is very easy, and you'll gain access to articles, tour diaries, over 40 hours of interviews and bonus mini-episodes, as well as much more. If you subscribe annually, you'll get a discount, and a further discount if you're a student. All of this can be found at patreon.com/a mic on the podium, and from just £5 a month, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. That's patreon.com. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Neil Thomson. Neil, it's that time when we have to go through the 10 questions, and the first two are lumped together as one. What sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
The sound I love is the sound of rain. That's really something that's special, especially living now in a dry place.
Yeah,
that's important. The thing I hate most are car alarms, really loud car alarms.
yes.
That sets my teeth on edge.
I would imagine you get tropical rain where you are. That is, when it falls, it's big fat drops of rain.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's very dry here. We're in the Sahara. I mean, it can be like sometimes 8 degrees, 9 degrees humidity. So it's very, very dry. But this is now getting towards the end of the rainy season. And when the rain comes, it's fantastic. Yeah. It's, as you say, it's like a shower outside.
Yeah. Wow, warm shower, lovely. Ooh.
Yeah,
don't mind it raining then, do you?
Yeah.
Number 3, Neil, is if you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
My ideal state is walking aimlessly around Paris.
Oh.
Sitting in cafes, reading, watching people. Just to be a flaneur, just someone who walks without aim.
Yeah.
And that was, I remember I did when I moved there in 2003. I would get up in the morning and I would just, today I'll turn right, today I'll go. But I had no idea where I was going. And you discover all sorts of wonderful things. And I love that thing of because we live as conductors, we're public people, we have to deal with people a lot, we work under a lot of pressure. So that 24 hours where it's just your time and you can do exactly what you want, go where you want, and you're not responsible for anyone or anything. That for me is my perfect. I did that for 6 weeks this year. I had to have a holiday, and we went to Paris for 6 weeks, and every day I was just wandering around.
Brilliant. I've done it. I've one time I worked there. I had some time off, and as you said, I was staying out in a suburb. Somebody lent me a flat on the 7th floor of one of those apartment buildings with no lift. So I wanted to do a lot of wandering on the ground because I only wanted to go up those stairs once per day because it was absolutely killing. But it's wonderful to just wander around. I remember the reason why I remember fondly the lunch we had together, the two of us with Ben Dawson, is that I seem to remember there being no time constraints. And we just sat and chatted and had one of those long, leisurely lunches. And the world was going on around us and about us and outside. And, we just sat and chatted and laughed. And to have no time constraints as a conductor is something quite rare. Because the next rehearsal or the next meeting or whatever it is.
Yeah. No, that's me. And Paris is a city that, you feel that you're living in history. Because the city has basically not changed very much for 100 years. There's a very nice book of postcards of the same street from 100 years ago and today. It's almost the same. And you can just take a little turning into a side street. And you're in, the old Montmartre of the Impressionist painters. Yeah. It's a wonderful thing. Wonderful thing. This connection with the past.
Well, what a perfect segue into the past. Number 4 is, who would be your favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
I think a person who became very important for me was Bernard Haitink. And that was after we worked, he came to the college and I got to know him a little bit. And he was a very important influence on me because his conducting, someone once said about him, Bernard makes things right before they've gone wrong. And I try to teach that to my students. By the way of conducting, you're already getting the orchestra, maximizing what the orchestra can give you.
Yeah.
Through well, I mean, ultimately it's what's in here, but it's how he expressed it. It was so distilled, his way of conducting. You know,
yes.
he managed to get just to the heart of every piece he conducted. And I know people say, no, when I was a student in the 80s, all the big guys were still alive. Karajan, Shlibodarski, Schulte, Bernstein. And Haitink, he wasn't seen as very interesting in those days. Boring Bernard, that was the sort of thing. And that, how some musicians talked about him, because he wasn't this huge personality. But now I see even his early recordings. Have you seen that video of him rehearsing Mahler 2?
Yes.
When he was young, and
yes.
I mean, he always had it. He always had it. And he's someone who I came really to appreciate a lot in later life, and he became like a reference point for me as a musician, and as how to be as a human being as well, how to treat people, So he would be the one who was more a more recent old past conductor. I think the people who I absolutely adore are Furtwängler, because he's temperamentally completely opposite to me, but I'm fascinated by him. If anyone knows how to mold the dynamic, the substance of a work, it was Furtwängler. I mean, I think he knows how to make material, how to shift it, when to move, when to pull back, and it was always different. And I think that's something that's important. The other one also very different, and someone who I've come to appreciate a lot, was Adrian Boult.
Oh, yes.
Because I still think, you listen to his Vaughan Williams and his Elgar, and he got to the heart of it. And what is remarkable is that he was so close to the music.
Yeah.
But I mean, because now we have the benefit of being able to listen to Boult's recordings or Barbaroli or whoever, but he was really close to it, and he managed always to get to the heart of a piece, also with a directness and a simplicity. So, yeah. Those three, I would say.
Well, Boult's name doesn't appear very much as an answer to this question at all. And I wonder why that is. Even amongst the Brits, and I've interviewed more Brits than anybody else, more Brits than lots of Americans, then it grades down. But even amongst the Brits, Boult's name doesn't come up that often. But as you say, Vaughan Williams and Elgar, and his recordings, absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
And also for what he did for British music, the first UK performance of Wozzeck. I mean, it's we forget that he did these things. No, I think probably the thing that links him and Haitink is this directness.
Yes.
It's a tremendous mental sophistication, but delivered with such directness and simplicity. I think that's.
Well, of those conductors who were still alive when I started my playing career, there are 2/3 I wished I'd played for. The /1 was Abardo. I'd love to have experienced an Abardo rehearsal in a concert as a player. Carlos Kleiber, obviously, for the obvious reasons, and the most quoted answer to question 4 there's been in the whole podcast. But also Haitink. I'd have loved to have played for Haitink, and I never did. And it, a shame, because I really, really admired, the fact that there were no histrionics in his face. There were pulling faces, and music just seemed to come from really deeply within him.
No, you feel that it's music when you someone like Haitink, you feel that music is a precious thing, and it's a serious thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think it's important for us to see this, especially these days. I think it's important that music is a serious and a precious thing.
Absolutely, I agree. Now, question 5: favorite current conductor. You may or may not know, but you were given as the answer to a favorite current conductor way back when. I mean, it's episode single figures. I think John Wilson, who your name's mentioned many times. I can't remember, it was something like episode 7 or 8. But I wonder who would be your favourite current conductor or conductors?
I would say the 2 people that I admire profoundly, and one is Simon Rattle.
Yes.
One is Simon Rattle. I mean, I talked many, many times when I came here to Brazil about how rattle was my model of what we could do for the orchestra, what we could do for the community.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and I watch him. He's a master. He's an absolute master. I mean, you know better than anyone. We've worked with him, and I think no, he's been a real inspiration to me. And the other one who I admire is John Wilson.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's John is a very special character because he's someone who, like Rattle, who just puts music first. He's only interested in music. He has an ferocious musical intelligence. He's scrupulously high standards. I mean, he's the sort of George Zell of the. I'm sure if I stood in front of the Symphony of London, I would say, "Oh, this sounds marvelous." I mean, John is one of those. Rattle has this quality as well. John could take a not very good amateur orchestra and make it sound good, and he can take an orchestra like the Symphony of London and make it sound better. Yeah. And that's a very rare skill that you can have on both. And his recordings are. I don't know if you've heard this recording of Strauss Metamorphosen.
I haven't.
Mike. I did the piece quite recently. I spent a lot of time listening to some very distinguished names. John's performance, for me, is the best performance. I mean, it's the best performance. It's so what the piece is and how the piece goes. He understands the dynamic of it. The tempi are absolutely perfect. The expression, because no one believes you. No one believes you. I mean, you will, but no one believes you when you say that because you have to say Karajan or Carl Böhm or Rudolf Kemper. But you listen to John's recording. I don't think there's any better recording. I can say that.
Well, I'm not surprised because I've said it before, possibly, and if I haven't, dear listener, well, you're in for a shock. I played in the CBSA for 22 years, and it's a world-class orchestra. But the best string section I ever played in was the John Wilson Orchestra, as it was then. I'd retired by the time John started the Symphony of London. But, maybe the phone would have rung, I don't know. But I played in his orchestra more than once, so I was obviously a valued person in it. As you said, it's his meticulous attention to detail with phrasing, with how he wants the strings to sound and the whole orchestra to sound. So I'm not surprised at all that a piece like Metamorphosen, you rate his recording as highly as you do, because I've played for him and I know what he expects from string playing. And it happens to be something I'm very hot on as well, that how the string sound is produced and balanced. A lot of it to do with bow speed and vibrato. And I agree. I'm not surprised. I should be digging it out.
Yeah, really, you're in for a treat. And also, he's someone who, you look at John's background, and I wonder if someone from that background today would have a chance in classical music.
I don't think they would. I really don't.
No, I mean, and he's, I can't think of anyone who deserves success more than John. I mean, I know him, and he's my best friend, but I know just how much he works. Yeah. And he was a student. He did everything. He took on everything. And that's what I said. That's what you have to do. I remember I had one student. Barry Wordsworth was looking for people for the ballet. There's normally a dearth of ballet conductors, and he said, "Do you have any students who would be interested to do it?" And I mentioned to my postgrads, and one of them said, "Absolutely yes, I'd love to do it." And the other one said, "I don't really want to conduct ballet." One now has a very good career. The other one now isn't conducting. So the lesson of that is you have to take everything that comes your way.
Absolutely. When you're a student. Yeah.
And John did. He was putting on concerts and organised. I remember the orchestra in Newcastle when he was a student. We did all three Respighi tone poems in one concert. I conducted it. I mean, he was always an entrepreneur. Yeah. But he's got to the stage now where he only cares about music. And this Symphony of London is really his life project.
Yeah.
And he's already, I mean, he's making benchmark recording after benchmark recording. So those two, Simon and John, I would say.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
For sheer concentration and stamina was Andriessen, the Stadt.
Louis Andriessen.
It's just 40 minutes of mixed meter changes and everything going against the beat. And it's one of those sort of pieces that that if you screw up, you take the ship down with you. It's not, it's not the right of spring where the orchestra can save you. but it's you take everyone down with you, and that was one of the most satisfying things I ever did. I remember we came off stage and one of the viola players burst into tears. She said, "I've never concentrated so much in my life."
Yeah.
So, and the other one that was difficult was I had to start rehearsing Tchaikovsky 6 the day after my father died.
Oh.
And that was...
Yeah. Well, that's hard.
Yeah, that was tough.
Especially the very ending with all of the... Well,
yeah,
whole of the last movement, but that,
yeah,
that's tough.
So that was tough. I had two performances of that, the week after he died. That was quite... That was definitely a piece I didn't touch until I think I did it here 2 years ago.
Right.
But I hadn't done it since.
Yeah.
So.
Right. I can well imagine that. That's really tough. And as for the piece I gave to this answer for in episode 50 was a similar experience to your Andreessen experience, where there were moments where I could have possibly screwed up because a lot of it was slow at the beginning, but it's a piece by Peter Maxwell Davies called World's Bliss. And
oh God!
Yeah,
this is the piece that Colin Davis said it's the most difficult piece he's ever conducted.
Oh well, he joins me, Rumen Gamba, and Leonard Slatkin, who have all given the same piece as the same answer. Because I came off from there, I was so relieved when I came off the platform. I did 1 or 2 or 3 journeys up the middle of Maida Vale Studio 1 to take bows to the audience, and then at some point somebody let me know, you are going to stand Max up to take his bow, aren't you? I'd forgotten he was in the audience. That's how stressed I was about the whole concert. And of course, then I did. I'd walked past him 3 times, and I was so zoned out. Not congratulating myself. It was just pure relief of getting to the end. So that Andreessen experience, I've been there. Not with that piece, but I've been there. Yeah. That's tough. When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
A book.
And you're an old-fashioned paper glued together down one side person.
Yeah, I prefer to read a book. It depends how heavy my hand luggage is. Because if you're going away, sometimes it just works out that you're going away for 3 weeks and you've got, So, but I prefer to read books. There's something comforting about them.
So. And are you somebody who will take a new book, or... I mean, I will often take 2. One that is I want to read and has been on a pile for a long time. I've got a pile right next to me of stuff, and probably an old friend or a book of cryptic crosswords or something like that to dip in and out of.
I normally take new books. I've got to the stage where I just realize I'm not going to read all the books that I would like to read, so I have to keep moving on. Yeah. There are certain things I would like to go back to, but I mean, I think I try to keep moving on. There's a Japanese word for this, sundoku or something. I forget what it's called. Sundoku, I think it is, which is it's a word that describes people who buy more books than they're ever going to read, just to have them in a pile.
Yeah.
So that's basically I've got more books than I'm ever going to read. So that's I always take new ones.
Number 8, real or fantasy question. It's totally up to you. What's the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
The one thing I would change is if I could sleep well the night before I go to a new orchestra. This horrible thing of lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, worrying about what it's going to be like if you don't know the orchestra, even if you do know the orchestra. That's something, if I could just know that I would sleep well the night before my first rehearsal, or avoid that horrible 15 minutes before when you're sitting in your dressing room waiting to go on, and you hear people arriving and tuning up and you don't know the orchestra, maybe it's a difficult program. If I could just those 2 things, if I could lose those, that would make my life less stressful.
I'm nodding. Yeah, absolutely. Both of those. I mean, I don't sleep that much anyway, and when I do, I sort of pass out. So I think if it's an orchestra, I might go 2 o'clock, but 3 o'clock if it's a new orchestra. But my God, those 15 minutes beforehand, that's normally when you'll find me, dear listener, outside smoking, maybe round the corner so as I don't see players coming in and out or whatever else. But that's when I'll be outside. And because your head is full of what's going to happen when you put that beat down, what am I going to be confronted with? Because sometimes it is confronted with, and is this going to go well? Is this going to go badly? Are we, there's so many thoughts, and you won't know until you're I'd possibly
Absolutely.
3 or 4 beats in, or possibly 3 or 4 minutes
Yeah.
in. But it's as quick as that. Often
Yeah.
you'll
Absolutely.
realise.
Yeah. And
And
if you,
then,
I think the thing for me that always makes me very nervous when I'm guest conducting is if the orchestra is sluggish. There's a sluggish reaction, and I'm
yeah,
not talking about playing behind the beat, but I'm talking about this sort of people waiting. And
yeah.
so this is always, so if you're doing La Valse, I'm always a little bit worried if you're going to get that sort of orchestra. And if you give it, if you set a tempo and what you set comes out, then you think, thank God, this is marvelous. If
Yeah.
you set a tempo and what comes out is a little bit slower, you think, okay, this could be a long week.
Yeah, yeah. I better get those gestural tools out of my toolkit that make people play faster. And even then, you try them and you think they ain't working. They obviously play this piece at this tempo, and yeah, and woe betide anybody try
That's
and
it.
go faster.
Yeah, I think in the way it's the thing that's always sort of slightly dispiriting, but I guess it's something we have to accept and we have to learn is that don't waste your time trying to make a whole orchestra play a piece that they know very well completely differently, because that feeling you might get it in the rehearsal, then the concert it goes back exactly the same. So
Yeah, yeah.
you end up irritating people for nothing in the end, because you get what they're going to give you anyway. So
It's an analogy I've used before, but it's my cake analogy that you stand in front of an orchestra and you're presented with a cake with a piece of music, and often as a guest it's a good idea to maybe suggest that we have a 3-tiered rather than a 2-tiered, and maybe we could add some extra icing down the sides and possibly trim it into a square cake rather than a round one. But don't put the cake in the pedal bin and try and make a new cake, because it ain't happening in 3 days work. It's just not happening. All you're going to end up is with an uncooked mess that is not edible to anybody. So yeah,
it's true, because also the other thing is that you can sometimes take people near the front of the orchestra with you and leave the rest of the section behind. That's happened, and so you realize that you can end up just making it sound worse, basically.
Yeah, so. Absolutely true. Number 9 is another real or fantasy question, and it is: what profession other than your own would you like to attempt or have liked to have attempted?
I think it would be something to do with books, something to do with literature, with writing. I'm not clever enough. I don't think I'm creative enough to be a novelist, but I think I'd be interested to be a historian, an academic. I've always had that. Maybe it's because I spent so much of my time dealing with people. We spend so much of our time dealing with people. Yes. The idea of sort of hiding away in a don's room in an Oxford college is sort of rather appealing to me. But it would be something to do with writing, whether it would be journalism, something academic. It would be that.
Number 10, my favourite question of them all, is: if the world were to end tonight, Neil, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, it was a toss-up, I have to say, and I sort of think about food that I miss living in Brazil, the sort of food that I would really like this. And I think I would have to plump for roast lamb with all the trimmings. That's something I really miss living here.
Yeah.
That traditional English roast lamb, and a pint of beer, probably a pint of London Pride.
Oh, yes. Brilliant. So, I have to ask, because I love and adore mint sauce on my roast lamb, but my missus always turns her nose up at me and says, "What? You have mint sauce? You're obsessed with mint sauce with lamb." Yes?
I'm a big mint sauce fan, absolutely.
Hooray!
I've even been known to eat mint sauce with other meats. I like it so much.
Well, now we're going down the road of an ex-cricket captain of mine who used to eat mint sauce with every single Sunday roast, regardless of the contents. Fair enough, but at least you like mint sauce on lamb, which is utterly brilliant. And utterly brilliant it's been to catch up with you again after such a long time. I do hope it isn't such a long time again. Thank you, Neil, for coming on the podcast, and I hope to see you very soon.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a real pleasure. Lovely to see you and to chat. So thank you for inviting me.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a conductor who initially studied in her native island before moving to the United States to continue her studies and become an assistant conductor. Since returning home, she started her own podcast and now also devises and runs courses and masterclasses for young conductors. But until then, bye-bye.